There's a moment, and I know this sounds strange, but bear with me. There's a moment right before something enormous goes wrong where the air just stops. Not the wind, not the sound, the air itself. Like the universe takes one long breath and holds it. I felt that moment at 3:47 hours on the morning of March 9th, 2289, standing in sublevel gamma of the Kalos containment facility on the outer ring of Europa Station. And I remember thinking, something is about to happen that I will spend the rest of my life trying to explain to people who weren't there. I was right. Chapter 1, where we were and why it mattered. Let me back up. Europa Station wasn't supposed to be a military installation. That's the thing people forget when they read the reports. They see the security ratings, they see the containment protocols, they see the words Galactic Defense Jurisdiction stamped across every third document, and they assume this was some kind of weapons bunker, some kind of fortress built for war. It wasn't. It started as a research outpost. 17 years before I got there, a joint species consortium, humans, Velurians, a handful of Dreth observers who never seemed to sleep, had established the station to study the deep ice layers of Europa. Something about ancient microbial signatures. Something about what the moon's subsurface ocean might tell us about how life spreads across a solar system. I'm not a scientist. I never pretended to be. I'm a security warden class 7 with a specialization in non-human behavioral containment. Which is a very long way of saying, I watch things that could kill people and I make sure they don't. By 2289, Europa Station had grown into something nobody had quite planned for. The research division was still there, still poking around in the ice, still running their sample analyses, still sending excited reports back to the academic council on Mars. But wrapped around it, like a fist around a candle, was the containment facility. 7 levels, 214 cells, 41 species represented across the inmate population, ranging from relatively manageable Kreth smugglers to things that didn't have names in any human language. I'm talking about the Vorkai. If you don't know what a Vorkai is, and until 3 years before this story, most humans didn't, let me paint you a picture. Imagine something that evolution decided to make perfect. Not perfect the way a cheetah is perfect or the way a shark is perfect. Those are specialized perfections, built for one thing. The Vorkai were built for everything. 7 feet tall at their smallest. Their bodies were covered in overlapping plates of bioluminescent keratin, not bone, not quite armor, something in between that could flex and harden depending on what the creature needed in any given moment. Their eyes were compound, like an insect's, but wrapped in an outer layer of clear protective membrane that could filter radiation, low-light environments, high ultraviolet conditions. They had 4 upper limbs, 2 of which ended in hands that could perform tasks of extraordinary delicacy, and 2 of which ended in what the xenobiologists diplomatically called impact appendages. The rest of us called them clubs. Their lower body was built for speed and leverage in equal measure. They could run, in an open environment, on flat ground, at speeds that made early human Vorkai encounter reports genuinely difficult to believe. One of the first field observers, a woman named Dr. Priya Castagno, had written in her initial report, I have seen the subject cover 40 meters in what my recording equipment confirms was 1.8 seconds. I am choosing to believe my equipment malfunctioned, because the alternative is frankly terrifying. The equipment hadn't malfunctioned. The Vorkai we had in sublevel gamma wasn't the smallest of its kind. Its name, the closest phonetic approximation our translation systems could manage, was Goruvith. And Goruvith had been in cell 17 for 11 months when the night of March 9th arrived. Chapter 2, the facility, the staff, the quiet before. Sublevel Gamma was the deepest inhabited section of Europa Station's containment wing. It sat roughly 400 meters below the station's main habitation deck, which itself sat beneath 18 meters of reinforced ice composite hull. The elevator ride down took 4 minutes on a good day, sometimes longer if the pressure seals needed cycling. Most of the staff hated Gamma. I understood why. There was something psychologically uncomfortable about being that far underground, even in a station that was itself underwater, orbiting a moon, orbiting a planet. The layers of below accumulated in the mind. You felt them. The lighting in Gamma was functional but not warm. Blue spectrum LEDs, because the xenobiology team had determined that Volkai responded less aggressively to blue wavelengths than to yellow or red. The walls were composite paneling over reinforced pressurized concrete, a hybrid material developed specifically for this level, capable of withstanding impacts that would have cracked standard hull plating. The smell, and this is one of those small details that you don't find in official reports, but that I think matters, the smell in Gamma was metallic and faintly humid, like the inside of a machine that runs too hot. The environmental systems worked overtime down there, maintaining temperature and pressure within the narrow tolerances that kept both human staff and the Volkai from becoming uncomfortable in ways that were dangerous for everyone. There were 6 of us on night rotation that shift. Warden Senior Delia Marchetti, who was my direct supervisor and the person I trusted most in that facility. She had 17 years of experience, and a manner of speaking that was so calm it could convince you the sun rising was no big deal. Technician First Class Yusuf Osman, who managed the containment field systems from a station near the main corridor junction. Yusuf was the kind of person who whistled quietly to himself when he was focused, and went very, very still when he was scared. Dr. Amara Nkosi, our on-call xenobiologist, who technically wasn't supposed to be in Gamma during night rotation, but who had a habit of coming down anyway because, in her words, the creature is most behaviorally interesting between 200 and 500 hours. Guard Specialist Tamaz Reyes, who was on his second posting to Europa Station, and who had the particular quality of being physically enormous and emotionally steady in ways that made him very good at his job. Guard Specialist Lena Voss, who was brilliant at pattern recognition and terrible at sleeping, which made her both an excellent night shift guard and someone who consumed alarming quantities of stimulant tea. And me, Warden Elias Varn, 8 years in the Galactic Containment Service, 4 postings, 3 species-specific certifications, 1 commendation I never talk about, and 1 file notation I really never talk about. We were 6 people responsible for a sub-level containing 11 active cells, one of which held a creature that the GCS Threat Assessment Board had rated at Containment Class 9. There were only 2 Class 10 designations in the entire Galactic Containment Service database. Everything else, everything, was Class 9 or below. Gorovith was Class 9. Chapter 3, the 11 MONTHS before. I want to tell you about the 11 months before that night, because you need to understand what Gorovith was like, what the baseline was, before you can understand what happened when things changed. Gorovith had been captured by a joint GCS Velurian enforcement team following an incident on the trading station Marrow Point, near the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. The details of the incident itself are still classified at a level I don't have access to. What I know is this: 4 galactic enforcement officers were injured in the apprehension. 2 of them never returned to active duty. The Volkai species as a whole had a complicated relationship with the Galactic Compact. They were not officially members. They had been offered membership twice. Both times, the offer had been declined in ways that the diplomatic corps described as unambiguous. There were Volkai who operated within compact space legally, under guest species protocols. There were Volkai who didn't care about the distinction. Gorovith, based on what I'd read in its file, was somewhere in between. The enforcement team's report described an entity that was not mindlessly violent. The Volkai were not mindless. Nobody who'd ever encountered one would make that mistake. But one that operated according to a value system that didn't map cleanly onto compact law. In 11 months, Gorovith had torn the primary containment barrier in Cell 17 on 2 separate occasions. Both times, the secondary and tertiary barriers had held. Both times, the engineering team had spent 72 hours reinforcing the primary. Refused food for a period of 23 days, until Dr. Nkosi had determined that the protein composition of the standard dietary provision was subtly incorrect for Volkai physiology and adjusted the formula. Made what the behavioral log described as sustained threatening displays toward 11 different staff members. And twice, just twice in 11 months, behaved in ways that Dr. Nkosi described in her careful scientific language as suggestive of communicative intent. I had been present for one of those 2 moments. It was a Wednesday, 300 hours. I was doing a standard corridor walk, passing the observation window of Cell 17, when Gorovith, who had been in its rest position against the far wall, a posture we associated with something like sleep, simply raised its head and looked at me. Not at the window, at me. The bioluminescent plates along its upper thorax shifted color. They did this sometimes. It was a physiological response, largely involuntary, the way a human's pupils dilate. But the shift that happened when it looked at me was different from what I'd seen in behavioral logs. Slower, more deliberate. I stood there, I didn't move. I didn't call for backup. I just stood there and looked back. After 47 seconds, I checked the timestamp later. Gorovith lowered its head and returned to its rest position. Dr. Nkosi, who reviewed the corridor footage the next morning, had come to find me with her tablet in her hand, and an expression on her face I couldn't quite read. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "I just looked at it." She stared at me for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notes and walked away without explaining. I thought about that moment a lot in the weeks that followed. I still think about it. Chapter 4, 347 hours. The night of March 9th started like every other night in Gamma. The shift handover at 2200 had been uneventful. The day rotation reported that Gorovith had been in an elevated activity state for most of the afternoon, pacing the cell in the pattern we'd come to recognize as stress behavior, the plates along its back cycling through colors faster than usual, but nothing beyond normal parameters, nothing that triggered an alert. By midnight, things had quieted. Yusuf's board showed all green. Cell 17's containment field was reading at 98.7%, slightly below optimal, but within acceptable range. Dr. Nkosi had noted it in her log and flagged it for the morning engineering team. I did my 100 corridor walk, standard, nothing to note. Lena ran her 2:30 behavioral scan. Gorovith was in a low-activity state. Vitals were within normal range for the species, as best as our sensors could measure. And then at 3:47, Yusuf's board stopped being green. The first thing that happened was an alarm I'd never heard before. Not the standard containment breach alert. I knew that one, we all did. It lived in a specific part of your nervous system. This was different. Lower. More resonant. It vibrated in the floor before it reached my ears, and by the time it reached my ears I was already standing up. "Yusuf." I said it quietly, because I'd learned years ago that calm voices in a crisis keep other people calm. "Primary field in Cell 17 just dropped to 31%, Yusuf said. His voice was remarkably steady. His hands, I noticed, were absolutely still. "Secondary is holding at 88, but Warden, primary shouldn't be able to drop that fast." "Something The second alarm cut him off. Not the same alarm, a different one sharper. Secondary field failure, Yusuf said, and now there was something in his voice that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. Reading at 44% and falling. I'm not reading a cause. There's no breach in the physical barrier, the field just. Where is Delia? Junction B, doing the 345 check. Tamaz, Lena, get to Junction B now. Delia, you on comms? Her voice came back immediately. I'm here, I see the board, what's Gorovith's position? Checking. Dr. Nkosi had come out of the side monitoring room, tablet in hand, and was pulling up the cell cameras. It's Elia's, it's awake, it's standing. It's at the barrier. There was a moment of silence on the comm line that lasted maybe 2 seconds and felt much longer. Yusuf, Delia said, tertiary field status. Tertiary is holding, 96%. But Delia, if we've lost primary and secondary are failing, I don't know why. The tertiary could. The third alarm was the one we'd all trained for and hoped we'd never hear. The sound it made was a long, sustained tone, not a beep, not a buzz, something more like the note a cello might make if you held the bow on the string indefinitely. And beneath it, through the composite walls of sublevel gamma, we heard something else. A sound I don't have adequate words for. I've tried, in the 14 months since that night, to describe it to people who weren't there. The closest I've gotten is this. Imagine the sound of a very large thing deciding. That's the best I can do. Gorovith was at the barrier. And the tertiary field was at 61% and falling. Chapter 5. What the reading said and what they didn't. Yusuf was working the board with both hands now, pulling data faster than I'd ever seen him work. It's not a power failure, he said. Station power is nominal. It's not a system fault. I'm running diagnostics and everything is reading functional. The fields are just. Delia, it's like something is absorbing them. Dr. Nkosi looked up from her tablet. In the blue light of gamma, her face was very still. Vorkai have bioluminescent biology, she said. We've always known that. But there are older studies, pre-compact contact research, that suggested some members of the species might have a passive electromagnetic interaction capability, a natural ability to generate interference patterns that could disrupt field-based systems. She paused. I raised this with the engineering team when we first received Gorovith. They reviewed the containment specifications and told me the fields were rated for it. They were wrong, Yusuf said. Yes, Dr. Nkosi said, they were wrong. Tertiary field, 42%. Okay, Delia said. She was in the corridor now. I could hear her footsteps on the deck plating, measured and even. Okay, emergency protocol sequence. Delia, Yusuf's voice had gone very quiet. If the tertiary fails, the next system in sequence is the physical barrier. Physical barrier is rated for sustained Vorkai impact for approximately. He checked something, 90 seconds. Nobody said anything for a moment. After 90 seconds, he continued, we're looking at a Class 9 breach in a sublevel with no active field containment and 6 staff members. More silence. All right, Delia said, and her voice was so calm that for a second I thought the situation had somehow resolved itself. Tamaz, Lena, get to the emergency elevator. Begin evacuation protocol for non-essential personnel. Amara, you're non-essential. I'm not leaving, Dr. Nkosi said. Amara. I'm not leaving, Delia. A pause. Yusuf, begin the emergency beacon sequence. Get a signal to the upper levels. We need the GCS response team down here. Another pause. How long until they could reach us? Yusuf didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. 12 to 15 minutes for full deployment, he finally said, if they move fast. Tertiary field, 23%. And in cell 17, Gorovith was pressing itself against the physical barrier. I know this because the camera feed on Dr. Nkosi's tablet was still running, and she held it up so I could see. I watched the creature, 7 feet of bioluminescent armor and 4,000 years of evolution, press its impact appendages flat against the barrier wall. And I watched the barrier wall begin to flex. Chapter 6: The Decision. What happened next is the part that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. The part that other people, security analysts, xenobiologists, GCS officials, journalists who somehow got hold of fragments of the incident report, have argued about, dissected, criticized, and occasionally praised. Delia was still in the outer corridor. She was 90 seconds away from Cell 17's viewing position, minimum. The tertiary field dropped to 11%. The physical barrier was flexing with each impact, not breaking yet, but flexing. And something happened in my head, something that I've tried to explain and never quite managed to. I didn't think tactically. I didn't run calculations. I didn't access any of the protocols in my training manual, not consciously anyway. What happened was simpler and stranger than any of that. I remembered Wednesday, 300 hours, standing at the observation window, looking at Gorovith while it looked at me. 47 seconds of nothing but mutual attention. And the creature lowering its head. I took off my equipment vest. This sounds like an insane thing to do. It probably was. The vest contained my comm unit, my emergency deterrent tools, my medical kit. Taking it off was against every protocol for a containment situation. I put the vest on the floor. Elias, Yusuf's voice low and strained. Elias, what are you? I'm going to the observation window, I said. That's the opposite direction from the evacuation route. Yes. Silence. Delia's voice now, still calm but with an edge in it I recognized. Elias, talk to me. I'm going to the window, I said again. I'm not going to do anything else, I just want to stand there. The barrier could fail while you're standing there. I know. Another silence. Why, she asked. And here's the thing, I didn't have a good answer. I had the memory of Wednesday. I had 47 seconds of a creature looking at me in a way that felt like something. I had 8 years of watching non-human animals and being taught over and over by every trainer I'd ever had that the first thing you do when you don't understand a creature's behavior is you observe. Not intervene. Not react. Observe. I just want to look at it, I said. And I walked to the observation window of Cell 17. Chapter 7: The Window. The observation window was 14 inches of trisilicate composite glass, strong enough to withstand pressures that would crush standard aircraft, but not rated for a sustained Class 9 impact. Nothing in Gamma was, outside of the barrier system itself. I stood at the window. Gorovith was 4 feet away from me. I want to try to describe what it looked like from that distance, with the tertiary field at 9% and the physical barrier flexing under its hands. The bioluminescent plates were running fast, cycling through colors I didn't have names for, colors in spectra that human eyes aren't really built to parse but can see anyway, like trying to read a word in a language you've never studied. The compound eyes were doing the thing they do when a Volkai is in an elevated state. The outer membrane had pulled back slightly, which exposed the full surface of the eye and made them catch the blue lighting in a way that looked almost incandescent. It was pressing against the barrier with what I can only describe as intent, not rage, not blind fury, something more deliberate than that. It wanted out, yes, but it wasn't out of control. It knew exactly what it was doing. It was 870 kilograms of the most efficiently designed predator the Galactic Compact had ever cataloged, and it was 4 feet away from me through 14 inches of glass. I looked at it. Tertiary field, 7%. Barrier flex, visible to the naked eye now. The composite material was doing what it was engineered to do, distributing the force across its surface. But there was a limit to how long it could keep doing that. I looked at Goruvith, and Goruvith looked at me. Here is what I did not do. I did not activate any deterrent system. I did not reach for any tool. I did not step back. I did not look away. Here is what I did do. I breathed slowly. The way you breathe when you're trying to keep your heart rate down, when you're trying to convince your body that everything is fine, when you're trying to project something, not confidence exactly. Steadiness. The absence of alarm. I put my right hand flat against the glass. Not reaching toward it, not gesturing, just resting my hand there, the way you might rest a hand against a wall. And I held completely still. What happened next took 12 seconds. I've seen the footage. I've counted them. For the first 3 seconds, nothing changed. The barrier flexed. The plates on Goruvith's thorax cycled fast. The tertiary field dropped to 4%. At second 4, Goruvith stopped pressing against the barrier. Not retreating, just stopping. The impact appendages were still touching the surface, but the pressure stopped. At second 6, the plate cycling slowed. At second 8, Goruvith's compound eyes, all of them, the full array, focused on me. Not on the window, on me. The same way they'd focused on Wednesday at 300. At second 10, the colors in the plates shifted. The fast, urgent cycling was replaced by something slower. A single color, deep and steady, a blue-green that I didn't have a reference for, that I'd never seen it produce before. At second 12, Goruvith lowered its head. Not a full bow, not submission exactly, but the angle changed. The upper body came down. The impact appendages drew back from the barrier surface. And it stopped. Tertiary field, 3%. Physical barrier, intact. In the silence that followed, I heard Yusuf make a sound I can only describe as someone releasing a breath they'd been holding since birth. "Delia," he said very quietly. "I see it," she said. Dr. Nkosi was the one who said out loud what I think everyone was thinking. "It stopped," she said. "Elias, it stopped." I still had my hand against the glass. "Yeah," I said. "Don't move," she said. "I'm not moving." We stayed like that, Goruvith with its head lowered on one side of the barrier, me with my hand on the glass on the other, for another 4 minutes and 33 seconds, until the GCS response team came down the elevator, and the situation was officially reclassified as contained. Chapter 8. The Aftermath of the First Night. The GCS response team consisted of 12 officers in full Class 9 encounter suits. They came down the elevator at 4:04 hours. They found sublevel Gamma intact. They found 6 staff members in various states of sustained calm that I think was partly genuine and partly performed. They found Cell 17's physical barrier, with stress fractures across 30% of its surface. And they found me still standing at the observation window, because nobody had told me to move, and I hadn't wanted to be the one to break whatever the moment was. The lead response officer, a woman named Commander Vasquez, who I'd never met before and whose expression upon entering Gamma was a study in carefully controlled disbelief, looked at the cell, looked at me, looked at the footage on Yusuf's board, and then looked at Delia. "Explain," she said. Delia explained. Commander Vasquez listened without interrupting. When Delia finished, Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "The tertiary field is at 3%, she said. "Yes." "The physical barrier has stress fractures." "Yes." And Warden Varn stood at the observation window. "Yes." "Without a vest." "Yes." Commander Vasquez looked at me. "Why?" she asked. And I said what I'd said to Delia over the comm. "I just wanted to look at it." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she turned to her team and began issuing orders: engineering assessment, field system reset, barrier evaluation, medical checks for all staff. She didn't say anything else to me that night. She did, I learned later, write 3 separate memos to GCS leadership about the incident. I was only allowed to read one of them, but the one I read, a behavioral assessment recommendation, contained a line that I've thought about many times since. Warden Varn appears to have achieved a de-escalation outcome through a mechanism that does not map onto any existing GCS protocol. Further observation of the relationship between this officer and the HFY subject is recommended before drawing conclusions. Further observation. That was one way to put it. The cell was under emergency lockdown for the following 72 hours. I was placed on administrative review, standard procedure after any incident of that magnitude. The engineering team worked continuously to reset the field systems. It took them 61 hours. During those 72 hours, I wrote my incident report, 14 pages. I described everything I've described here as precisely as I could in the dry language that official reports require. When I handed it to Delia, she read it in silence, then looked up at me. "You know what the review board is going to say," she said. "Probably. They're going to say you violated protocol. They're going to say removing your vest was reckless. They're going to say standing at the window was reckless." "Probably. Are you going to argue with them?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I violated protocol, that's accurate. I was also reckless. That's also accurate." I paused, "but the barrier is intact." Delia looked at me for a long moment. "Yeah," she said, "the barrier is intact." She signed the report. During those 72 hours, Dr. Nkosi barely slept. I know because I passed her office at intervals throughout, and the light was always on. On the 3rd day, she came to find me. She had a tablet in her hand, which was normal. The expression on her face was not her normal expression. It was something more tentative, more careful. "I've been reviewing everything we have on HFY social behavior," she said, "and I want to show you something." She pulled up a display. A series of xenobiology survey images of HFY in their natural environment, documented by observation teams before and during the first contact period. "This," she said, pointing to an image. "Do you see what that individual is doing?" In the image, a HFY smaller than Goruvith, with a lighter coloration in its plates, was standing with its head lowered, standing before another HFY, the larger one. "Head lowering," I said. "In HFY behavioral taxonomy," Dr. Nkosi said, "it's associated with what the survey team translated as acknowledgement of worth." She paused. "Not submission, not defeat, something closer to recognition, respect, the acknowledging of someone as a being whose presence merits attention and consideration." She looked at me. "The larger HFY in this image is a pack elder, a recognized authority. The smaller one isn't being dominated, it's being respectful." I looked at the image. "And Goruvith," I said. "Yes," she said. "Elias, I think when Goruvith lowered its head at you both times, it wasn't reacting to a threat. It wasn't being subdued. I think it was acknowledging you." The silence between us held for a moment. "As what?" I said. Dr. Nkosi looked at the tablet, then at me. "That," she said, "is the question I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to answer." End of Part 1. Part 2, The Reckoning. Chapter 9, The Review and the Decision. 4 months passed between the night of March 9th and the day I was called into Commander Vasquez's office. 4 months of Gamma returning to something like routine. 4 months of Goruvith in a repaired, respecified Cell 17 with upgraded field systems that the engineering team assured us would hold against even the electromagnetic disruption capability the creature had demonstrated. 4 months of Dr. Nkosi filing behavioral reports that grew increasingly urgent in tone, and 4 months of GCS leadership in Geneva Station reading those reports with what she described as worrying levels of bureaucratic inertia. 4 months of me doing my corridor walks, my 100 rounds, my 300 rounds. And at 300 sometimes, Gorovith would be at the observation window. Not doing anything, not pressing against the barrier, just standing there. And I would stop. And we would look at each other. The plate colors during those moments were always the same. That slow, steady blue-green, the one I didn't have a name for. Dr. Nkosi, who had installed an additional monitoring system specifically calibrated for these interactions, had cataloged every one of them. 41 occurrences over 4 months. She had a name for the color now, after extensive spectral analysis and comparison with Voakai bioluminescent communication research. She was calling it Vethkal, using the closest Voakai phonemic approximation she could produce. Rough translation, she told me, is something like the color of not threat, the color that says, I see you and I am not afraid and I am not attacking. That's what it's saying to me, I said. That's what I think it's saying, yes. I looked at her. What does it mean that I'm saying it back? I asked. Dr. Nkosi smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. That's what I've been trying to explain to GCS leadership for 4 months, she said. The meeting with Commander Vasquez was not what I expected. I expected a disciplinary review, a formal reprimand, maybe a recommendation for reassignment. The administrative review had been completed 6 weeks after the incident, and its conclusions had been, officially, that I had violated protocol in a manner that was ultimately not harmful, and that my continued posting to Gamma was approved pending further review. Further review turned out to be Commander Vasquez herself, who had apparently been studying the incident with more attention than I'd realized. She had Dr. Nkosi's reports on her desk, all 4 months of them. She had the footage from the observation window. She had a file I didn't recognize, which she kept closed during our conversation. She looked at me for a long moment when I sat down. You've been doing the 300 corridor walk every shift, she said. It's standard rotation. You linger at cell 17. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. Nkosi's reports suggest the subject's behavioral indicators normalize significantly during your shift compared to any other officer's rotation. She tapped one of the reports. Physiological stress markers, plate activity, ambient sound production, all of it runs lower when you're on watch. I know. Do you know why? I thought about that. I think, I said carefully, that it knows I'm not afraid of it. You should be afraid of it. I know. It nearly breached a Class 9 containment. I know. And you're not afraid of it. I thought about this for a moment. Thought about standing at the window on March 9th. Thought about 47 Wednesdays of 300 stairs through trisilicate glass. I'm careful, I said. I'm cautious, but afraid, I paused. Afraid is what makes you flinch. Afraid is what makes you react before you understand what you're reacting to. I'm not afraid of Gorovith in that way. Another pause. I think it knows the difference. Commander Vasquez looked at me for a very long moment. Then she opened the file I didn't recognize. 3 weeks ago, she said, GCS leadership received a formal diplomatic request from the Voakai Territorial Authority. It's the first official communication they've made with the compact in 11 years. She slid a document across the desk. They're asking about Gorovith. I looked at the document. It was dense with diplomatic language that I wasn't fully equipped to parse, but the core request was clear enough. The Voakai wanted to know where Gorovith was. They wanted to know its status. And they were, in the careful, weighted language of species who have learned how to speak to the compact, without quite saying what they mean, expressing something that could be interpreted as a desire for resolution. "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means," Vasquez said, "that GCS leadership has approximately 60 days to decide what to do with Gorovith before this becomes a diplomatic incident." She looked at me steadily. "And it means that you, specifically you, because of what happened in March and what Nkosi's reports say has been happening since, are going to be central to whatever decision gets made." I put the document down. "I'm a warden," I said. "Yes. This is above my pay grade." "Yes," she said again. "But your pay grade is apparently the only one that can stand at a window and make a Class 9 lower its head." There was a long silence. "What are they considering?" I asked. Vasquez folded her hands. "There are two options on the table," she said. "The first is extended containment with the current situation continuing indefinitely. The second," she paused, "the second is a direct communication attempt, with Gorovith, using you." I sat with that for a moment. "Nobody has ever had a successful direct communication with a contained Volkai," I said. "No. The translation systems we have are rated for Velurian, Dreth, and 6 other species, not Volkai. Nkosi believes there may be a non-linguistic communication pathway, based on what she's observed between you and the subject. Based on looking at each other through glass. Based on more than that," Vasquez said, and she pulled out the last page of Nkosi's most recent report and slid it across. "Read the last paragraph." I read it. Dr. Nkosi had written, "The bioluminescent exchange occurring during Warden Varn's 300 interactions is not incidental. Spectral analysis confirms that the subject's plate activity during these interactions produces a consistent, repeated pattern that does not occur at any other time. This pattern appears to be communicative rather than reactive. The subject is not responding to a stimulus. It is generating a signal. Whether Warden Varn is consciously or unconsciously generating a reciprocal signal through physiological means we do not yet understand, or whether the subject is simply acknowledging the absence of threat signal from one specific individual, the interaction represents the most significant non-hostile contact between a contained Volkai and a compact staff member in the history of GCS operations. If any pathway toward communication exists, it runs through this man." I put the page down. "She never told me she'd written this," I said. "She told me she was afraid if she told you, it would change the way you behaved during the corridor walks." Vasquez almost smiled. She was probably right. Chapter 10, The Preparation. I'm going to try to describe the next 3 weeks accurately, without making them sound more dramatic than they were. Because the truth is, they were mostly just work. Uncomfortable, unprecedented, frequently confusing work, but work. Dr. Nkosi became my primary partner for the communication attempt preparation. She was, by that point, the foremost human expert on Volkai behavior, partly by virtue of having spent months observing Gorovith, and partly by virtue of having spent those months reading every piece of pre-compact and early compact research on the species that existed. She taught me things. The bioluminescent plates, she explained, were not just a stress indicator. They were a complex communication system, analogous to facial expression, body language, and to some degree vocal tone, all combined into one. Volkai who were familiar with each other could read these signals with extraordinary nuance. The challenge was that the signals were partly involuntary, like the way a human's face flushes when they're angry, even when they don't want it to, and partly deliberate. Learning to distinguish between the two was something Volkai spent years developing. In the same way, humans learn to read subtle expressions. "I've been producing signals," Dr. Nkosi told me during our third preparation session. "Not bioluminescent ones, you can't, obviously, but Volkai are multimodal communicators. They read electromagnetic fields, heart rate fluctuations in organisms that emit detectable bioelectrical signals, micro-movement patterns, posture. She paused. When you stand at that window, your heart rate is lower than any other staff members when they're in proximity to the cell. Significantly lower. How do you know my heart rate at 300? I installed biometric monitors in the corridor 7 weeks ago. She said this without any apparent guilt whatsoever. Amara, you didn't need to know. It would have changed the data. She moved on. The point is, Gorovith is reading something from you that it's not reading from anyone else. A quality that its behavioral system categorizes as something like non-threat peer. You produce the signals of something that is calm, aware, present, and not aggressive. That's apparently an unusual combination. Why unusual? Because most things that are that calm around a Volkai are either apex predators or, she hesitated, or they're another Volkai. I sat with that for a moment. You're saying it might think I'm saying it has categorized you in a category that contains very few entities, she said carefully. I don't want to overinterpret. But the behavioral evidence is consistent. The practical preparation involved 3 things. First, barrier modifications. The engineering team installed a communication membrane in the barrier of cell 17, a panel that could be opened to allow direct sound transmission between the cell and the corridor, while maintaining physical separation. This had never been used before. The engineering team had never been asked to install one for a Class 9 cell before. The second thing was a signal system that Dr. Nkosi developed specifically for this attempt. Not a translation system, we didn't have one, but a set of environmental controls that could modulate the lighting in the cell, altering the wavelength and intensity of the blue spectrum LEDs in patterns she believed might be readable by a Volkai as intentional signals. Basic signals, non-threat, attention, acknowledgement. The third thing was harder to prepare and impossible to train. Me. What I needed to bring into that corridor when the membrane opened was exactly what I'd been bringing every time I stopped at the window at 300. The real version, not a performance. Dr. Nkosi was very clear about this. Volkai can detect inauthenticity, she told me, not in some mystical sense physiologically. The stress chemistry of a body performing calm is different from the stress chemistry of a body that actually is calm. If you go in there trying to pretend to be steady. I know, I said. You need to actually be steady. I know, Amara. She looked at me. Are you going to be? I thought about the question honestly. I don't know, I said, but it's the only thing I know how to do. Chapter 11, The Morning of the Attempt. July 12, 2289, 2:30 hours. We'd chosen the time deliberately. Gorovith's behavioral patterns consistently showed the lowest agitation readings in the 200-500 window. Dr. Nkosi called it the creature's contemplative phase, a term that made the GCS oversight officer who'd been sent to observe the attempt visibly uncomfortable, because it implied a type of interiority that complicated a lot of containment classifications. The oversight officer's name was Director Soren Hawks. He was from Geneva Station. He wore a suit in a facility where everyone else wore either uniforms or lab coats, and he watched everything with an expression that suggested he was calculating liability continuously. I didn't like him. He probably didn't like me. But he was there and he was watching, and I understood why. The corridor outside cell 17 had been quietly prepared. Extra monitoring equipment, the lighting control panel for the signal system. A safety team positioned 60 meters down the corridor, close enough to respond, far enough not to crowd the space. Delia was there, she'd insisted on it. Yusuf was at his board, Lena was with him. Tamaz was with the safety team. Dr. Nkosi stood at my right. I stood at the communication membrane panel, in the barrier wall of cell 17. "Ready?" Dr. Nkosi asked. "Give me a second," I said. I took a moment, stood quietly, felt my heartbeat in my chest faster than I wanted it but not racing, breathed, slowed it down. Thought about nothing. This sounds glib. It wasn't. Learning to think about nothing is actually difficult, and I'd been working at it consciously for the past 3 weeks. Not meditation in any formal sense. I didn't have time to become a meditation practitioner. Just the practice of releasing things, not carrying the what-ifs into the room. My heart rate settled. "Ready," I said. Dr. Nkosi activated the lighting sequence. In cell 17, the blue spectrum LEDs shifted, a slow, modulated change in wavelength, moving toward the blue-green end of the spectrum, the signal she developed for non-threat approach. Then she opened the communication membrane. Chapter 12. What happened in cell 17? The sound came through immediately. Gorovith's breathing, low, rhythmic, resonant in a frequency range that sat at the bottom edge of what I could hear. It was a sound like the station itself breathing, like something enormous simply being alive. I couldn't see into the cell clearly from my position at the membrane. The angle was wrong. But the camera feed on the tablet Nkosi held showed me what was happening inside. Gorovith was in its rest position, back against the far wall. The plates were running the slow, steady cycling pattern we associated with its contemplative phase. It hadn't reacted yet to the light shift. I stood at the membrane. 30 seconds passed. Then the camera feed showed Gorovith's head come up. Slowly, without urgency. The way you raise your head when something in your environment changes and you're deciding whether it matters. The plates shifted. The cycling quickened slightly, not to the rapid, urgent cycling of March 9th, but something more alert, more attentive. Gorovith was processing the light change. 50 seconds. Then it stood up. From its rest position, rising in a single fluid movement that reminded me, every single time I saw it on footage, of how something that large should not be able to move that gracefully. It moved toward the membrane. Behind me, I heard Director Hawks make a quiet sound. I didn't look back. Gorovith was at the membrane. The membrane was 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall, a slot in the composite barrier, covered by a mesh of material that allowed sound and air to pass while maintaining physical separation. Large enough for communication, not large enough for much else. Gorovith pressed its face, or the nearest Volkai equivalent, toward the mesh. The compound eyes focused. On me. Here is what I did. I held still. I kept my breathing even. I put my right hand against the mesh. The same gesture I'd made at the window on March 9th. The same gesture I'd been making at the observation window for 4 months of corridor walks. And I said the only thing I knew how to say. "Hey," I said quietly, softly, "I'm here." I know how that sounds in a formal report. I know Director Hawks's written assessment of the attempt described the opening verbalization as non-protocol and linguistically minimal. I know Dr. Nkosi, bless her, defended it by pointing out that no protocol existed and that the linguistic content was probably not the operative variable. She was right. What mattered was the tone, the steadiness. The fact that it was 2 syllables produced by a human body in a calm state, close enough to the mesh for Gorovith to detect whatever bioelectric and chemical information it processed from biological organisms in proximity. Gorovith was still. The plates ran slow blue-green. 20 seconds of silence. And then Gorovith made a sound. I don't know how to write the sound. I've tried. It was deep, much deeper than anything in the human vocal range, and it had a resonance that I felt in my chest cavity rather than heard with my ears. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a growl. It was more structured than either of those things. Dr. Nkosi, afterward, would spend 3 weeks analyzing the acoustic profile of those 4 seconds. Her analysis suggested it was a complex vocalization, multiple simultaneous frequency bands, suggesting the Voikai vocal system operates polyphonically in ways human vocal anatomy can't replicate. In the moment, I didn't have any of that analysis. In the moment, I just heard it. And something in my body, in whatever part of the human nervous system, is older than language and older than civilization and older than the idea of species boundaries, heard it as something like, "I know you are there." I didn't say anything. Gorovith made the sound again, shorter this time, 2 seconds. Then it did something that Dr. Nkosi's tablet recorded with extraordinary clarity, and that the monitoring equipment preserved in 17 different data formats, and that Director Hawks watched with an expression that I will remember for the rest of my life, because it was the expression of a person encountering something they don't have a category for. Gorovith raised one of its hands, not an impact appendage, one of the delicate ones, the ones that ended in fingers capable of fine work, and it placed it against the mesh. Over mine. Not touching me, the mesh was between us, but the placement was deliberate and precise. The hand covered the same space as mine. The plates along its thorax ran deep blue-green, steady and slow and deep as something underwater. The sound it made then was the quietest it had been, almost not a sound, a resonance. I looked at Gorovith through 12 inches of separation, and it looked at me. And I thought, in the silence of that moment, in the blue-green light of sublevel gamma, 400 meters below the surface of Europa Station, I don't know what you are, and you don't know what I am, and we're both doing our best with that. Chapter 13. What came after the silence? The formal contact session lasted 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, Gorovith remained at the membrane for 17 of them. It vocalized 11 separate times. It maintained the hand-against-mesh gesture for 6 continuous minutes. The lighting signal system, operated by Dr. Nkosi, ran through the 8 signals she developed: non-threat, acknowledgement, attention, presence, calm, recognition, request, and finally what she called open. Each time a signal ran, she noted whether Gorovith's plate coloration changed in response. 7 of the 8 produced measurable responses. At minute 18, Gorovith withdrew from the membrane, not retreating, backing up slowly, the way you back up from a conversation when the conversation feels complete rather than interrupted. It returned to the center of the cell. It stood there for a moment. Then it made one final sound, the longest of the session, lasting nearly 8 seconds, and lowered into its rest position. Dr. Nkosi closed the membrane. The silence in the corridor afterward was the particular kind of silence that happens when everyone present is trying to figure out what, exactly, they just witnessed. Director Hawks spoke first. What, he said, just happened? Dr. Nkosi was already on her tablet, pulling up the plate response data, but she answered him without looking up. First contact, she said. Very rough first contact, but contact. Hawks looked at me. I was still at the position where the membrane had been. My hand was at my side now. My heart rate, which I learned later from Dr. Nkosi's hidden biometrics, had peaked during the hand-over mesh moment at slightly elevated, but not what any reasonable person would call alarmed. Warden Varn, he said. Director, what was your subjective experience of the session? I thought about this, about how to translate something that existed mostly in the register of felt sense into language that would be useful for an official report. It felt like a conversation, I said. I don't know what was said, but it felt like a conversation. Hawks looked at me for a moment longer. Then he made a note on his own tablet and turned to speak to his assistant. Behind me, Delia put her hand briefly on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Chapter 14, The 31 Days. What followed the July 12th session is documented in GCS records that are partly classified and partly available in summary form to anyone with enough institutional patience to submit the right requests. What I can tell you is this. Director Hawks returned to Geneva Station with his recordings and his analysis. He submitted his report within 2 weeks. The report's conclusions, which I was eventually allowed to read in a redacted form, recommended a continuation of the communication attempt under structured conditions, citing what it described as unprecedented positive behavioral indicators, and recommending assignment of a dedicated xenolinguistics team to work alongside Dr. Nkosi. The xenolinguistics team arrived 31 days later. 3 people, none of whom had ever worked with Voakai before, all of whom were brilliant in ways that made them simultaneously impressive and occasionally maddening to work with. During those 31 days, I continued my corridor walks. And at 300, Gorovith continued to be at the window. The plate color was always the same. The slow, deep blue-green. Vethkal. The color of not threat. The color of I see you. On the 22nd day after the contact session, Dr. Nkosi found me in the break room at 4:45 hours, after my shift had ended and before my sleep cycle was supposed to start. She sat down across from me without preamble. She had her tablet. She always had her tablet. I've been refining the translation of the vocalizations from July 12th, she said. Any progress? Some. She looked at the tablet. The acoustic analysis gives me frequency patterns. Cross-referencing with the very limited pre-compact Voakai linguistic research gives me some structural parallels. It's approximate, very approximate. But she put the tablet on the table between us. The third vocalization, the 2-second one, after it repeated the initial call. I looked at the tablet. The acoustic waveform was displayed, incomprehensible to me as data, but visible as a shape. My best approximation, she said, based on the pattern analysis and the behavioral context, is something like, I see one who is not afraid. I sat with that. And the one at the end, I asked, the 8-second one before it lay down. She was quiet for a moment. This one I'm less certain about, she said. It's structurally more complex, but the closest translation I can produce, she paused. It comes out something like, this is a thing worth returning to. The break room was very quiet. That might not be right, she said. The translation methodology is rough. I might be projecting. Amara, I said. She stopped. I think you're right, I said. She looked at me. Because you're a xenobiologist with 4 months of data, she asked. No, I said, because that's what it felt like. She picked up her tablet. She didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, very quietly. Me too. Chapter 15. The day the answer came. The diplomatic response from the Voakai Territorial Authority arrived on August 3rd, 2289. Commander Vasquez called me into her office at 800. Delia was already there. Director Hawks was present via secure transmission from Geneva Station. The response, translated by the Compact's Diplomatic Translation Service, was 7 paragraphs long. I won't reproduce it in full. Some of it remains in diplomatic channels, but the relevant portions were these. The Voakai Territorial Authority acknowledged the communication attempt of July 12th. They had been informed of it. How? I still don't entirely understand. The mechanisms of information exchange in species-to-species diplomacy are more complex and more opaque than most people realize. They described the session, in their diplomatic language, as a demonstration of the understanding posture. They identified me, specifically, by whatever means they had of identifying specific individuals, as the human who had produced what they called the still body signal on the night of March 9th. And they made a proposal. They were requesting a direct diplomatic exchange between their designated representative and the individual they described as the still-body human. Me. They want you to go to them, Vasquez said, when she'd let me read the document. I'm a containment warden. You're the still-body human, she said. Apparently that's what matters to them. I looked at the document. Where? I asked. Neutral space. There's a station Velurian jurisdiction, acceptable to both parties at the Lagrange point between Jupiter and Saturn. The proposal specifies a format, their representative, you, and one advisor each. Advisor, I said. Dr. Nkosi has already agreed, Vasquez said, and she didn't quite smile, but something close to it crossed her face. I looked at Delia. You knew about this, I said. Since yesterday, she said. I wasn't allowed to tell you until the formal briefing. And you think I should go? She looked at me evenly. I think, she said, that you're the only person who can. Chapter 16. The negotiation that isn't this story. I went. On August 19, 2289, Dr. Nkosi came with me. What happened at the Lagrange station is a different story, one that took 5 days and that I may tell someday when more of it has been declassified. What I can tell you is that the Voakai representative's name, in the closest phonetic approximation, was something that Dr. Nkosi transliterated as Kael'Voruth, and that Kael'Voruth was one of the most remarkable beings I have encountered in 8 years of working with non-human species. What I can tell you is that the still-body signal was, apparently, something the Voakai had a name for, had always had a name for. They'd been observing humans intermittently for longer than the Compact's official contact history suggested, and in all that time, in all those observations, what they called the still-body signal had been extraordinarily rare. A human who could be still, not just physically, emotionally, in the presence of something vast and capable of harm. Not because of ignorance, not because of arrogance, but because of something the Voakai language had a word for that Dr. Nkosi spent 3 weeks after we returned trying to translate, and eventually rendered as something like the understanding that size and danger are not the same as absence of worth. I'd stood at a window and looked at a creature that could have killed me. And somehow in a language I didn't know I was speaking, I'd said, I see that you are here. I am not afraid. I am paying attention. And that, to the Voakai, was the entire content of what they'd been waiting to hear from someone for a very long time. Chapter 17. What happened to GORRUVTH? On September 4, 2289, following the diplomatic exchange and a formal resolution process that involved approximately 400 documents and 3 separate GCS review boards, Gorovith was released from Cell 17. Not to freedom exactly. Not yet. There was a transition protocol, a formal period in a supervised but open environment on Ganymede Station, with monitoring and a continued communication framework. But the cell was empty. I stood at the observation window of Cell 17 on September 5 at 300, doing my corridor walk, and the cell was empty, and the lights were on at standard maintenance levels, and there was no blue-green glow from anywhere on the other side of the glass. I stood there for a few minutes anyway. Old habit. The corridor was very quiet. Delia found me there eventually. She'd been doing her own rounds. You doing okay? She asked. Yeah, I said, I think so. She stood next to me, and we both looked at the empty cell for a moment. Strange, she said. Yeah. Good strange or bad strange? I thought about it. Good, I said, I think good.